So before I get started, since I work for the Fed, I get to give you the disclaimer that the views I'm going to express today are mine alone, and they don't represent an official position of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve System. Okay, so where are we now? It's been just an insane 2 years. I joined the Fed 3 years ago, so 1 year pre-pandemic, and during that 1 year, I would talk to economists that were at the Fed during the Great Recession, and I would get super jealous because I would think, man, I bet it was interesting to be an economist during the Great Recession. And now I'm no longer jealous because this is a much more interesting period of time as an economist in a lot of different ways. But after having the largest one-quarter decline in history in GDP, and the largest one-quarter increase in history in 2020. 2021 really was about recovery, and I'll show you some of that, but it's hard, we can't gloss over how much we really have recovered post-pandemic, and even though we're probably, now we seem to be transitioning from pandemic to endemic, but we really have recovered to a great degree. However, there are some sectors that have really been hit hard, and I'll talk about that. That's true both nationally and within the state. GDP growth has been really phenomenal. Employment growth has been a little less phenomenal. So GDP growth has certainly outpaced employment growth, and there's a lot of question marks still in labor markets. So I'm going to spend a lot of time today talking about labor markets. And then inflation is obviously well above our 2% average target. So the Federal Reserve has an average target of 2%, which means sometimes we're going to be below 2%, which actually we were for quite a number of years leading up to this. Sometimes we're going to be above, but certainly not as far above as we are right now. And most of this is driven by continued labor shortages, which is increasing wages, and then also supply chain issues, which has really impacted prices, especially in new and used car markets. So if you look at the CPI numbers year over year for end of 2021 compared to end of 2020, prices were up 7.5% overall. Used car prices were up 40.5%. So actually that increase alone is driving a relatively large percentage of inflation. I'll show you a picture that shows that. That's due to the chip issue, right, and some supply chain issues. Inflation, though, I'll show you a picture that will show you that it has become more broad-based in recent months, hence the Fed saying, we're gonna increase the speed at which we're ending asset purchases, and we're going to increase rates, which they just did by 25 basis points. And in the statement, they clearly said that more increases will be needed this year. And I'll also show you the projections of how many that will be. Let's start going through some of this. So this is real GDP by quarter, growth by quarter, and you'll see this largest decline in history and the largest increase in history. We've been growing relatively fast since then. And you'll see these projections on several slides that I do today. Every other meeting, the FOMC participants, what's the FOMC? Federal Open Markets Committee, that's the group that votes on interest rates, okay? Also votes on asset purchases, that stuff. It is comprised of, there's 12 regional bank presidents, including our president, Tom Barkin, at the Richmond Fed. And then there should be 7 Federal Reserve governors, with Jay Powell being the head of that group, okay? Right now there's some openings, so there aren't 7, but it should be 19 people that meet every approximately 8 weeks to discuss monetary policy. 12 of those 19 people vote at each meeting. Every other meeting, they make projections on what they think is going to happen to GDP, employment, and a few other things over the next few years. And so these are the FOMC members' projections. They did do projections at the meeting 2 days ago. So you'll see they're projecting relatively strong growth this year and then kind of a return to normal. This is super interesting, though. This is GDP in levels. So the last one I showed you was growth. This is in levels. Let me show you what you're looking at here. The blue dotted line is GDP growth trend pre-Great Recession. The red line is post-Great Recession pre-pandemic. And what you'll see is after the Great Recession, we never got back to pre-Great Recession trend. We had really lagging growth, and the recovery took quite a long period of time. If you look at how long it took to get back, from where GDP was before the Great Recession to get back to that point took until 2013, I think, second quarter 2013, I believe. So about 5 years. This time, though, what you'll notice is already we are above where we were pre-pandemic, so GDP has more than recovered at this time, and GDP, as a Econ 101 reminder, is the value of all final goods and services made within the boundaries of the United States, okay? So GDP has more than recovered at this point, but interestingly, the trend is estimated to increase now. So there's some signs that we might actually get back to that pre-Great Recession trend in the next few years. So it really is incredible if you think about everything that's happened since March 2020, that we are now making more stuff than we were before, okay? That the final value of goods and services is higher. But as I mentioned, this doesn't mean universally that things are great. They're not. One of the things that we've had, so this is total personal consumption. Consumption makes up about 70% of GDP. So sometimes you'll hear, so goes consumption, so goes the economy. That really is true in a lot of respects because it makes up such a big part of GDP. So this is total consumption. This is spending on services. We spend a lot more money on services than we spend on goods. Because if you think about what you spend your money on, services includes everything from haircuts to health insurance to childcare. We spend a lot on services. What you'll see, though, is during the pandemic, we really had a movement from spending on services to spending on goods. Perfect example of this is that a lot of the leisure services that you would consume weren't available during the pandemic. So Carowinds, the amusement park right up the street from my house, they were closed for a period of time, right? So all these families that normally buy season passes to Carowinds, instead of doing that, they did things like buy kayaks and take them down the river instead, or buy an RV and drive around. So people shifted their spending from spending on services to spending on goods. We can see that is starting to even back out to where we would expect it to be. Okay, so in the service sector, there are more companies that are still hurting than you would see in the goods sector. This is employment, though, and these new numbers just came out recently. So in February, we added 678,000 jobs, which was above expectation. And you can see that really since last June, we've been adding 400,000 to 700,000 jobs a month, which is great. That's very strong growth. Pre-pandemic in a normal world, if you add more than about 70,000, that's thought of as good because you need to add about 70,000 jobs to keep up with people retiring, passing away, things like that. So pre-pandemic, a month with 200,000 jobs would be like a really great month. So these are very strong employment growth months, but we have not gotten back to pre-pandemic employment. I will also point out to you that one thing that is also different is that a job counts as a job here. And so I also think even though we're adding back some jobs, some people are working less than they did before. And so it might be the same number of people working, but fewer hours overall. So I'll give you an example. We talked to a lot of different employers, and talking to airlines, they've seen pilots really reduce the number of hours they're working. Flight attendants too, saying, you know what, I like being a pilot, but I've realized also hate my schedule, and so I'm willing to still be a pilot, but I'm going to work less hours, right? And I think we've seen that in a lot of different fields. Manufacturing, we've seen it as well. The overall number of hours worked per week has declined by workers. So just because we're adding back a lot of jobs doesn't mean we're necessarily adding back the same number of hours we did before. So employment recovery has lagged. And in places like Greenville, or all over the Carolinas really, I'm the economist for North and South Carolina, in these rapidly growing places, we're adding back a lot of jobs, but we're not back to pre-pandemic employment yet, and we have a lot more people to serve in the state than we did before the pandemic. So we need to get back pretty far above where we were in February 2020 to feel like we have kind of the same number of people working. South Carolina, one of the things that's been really different this time around, if you go back here, this is the Great Recession. And during the Great Recession, I was an economics professor then, and I would tell my students, South Carolina has the second worst unemployment rate in the country. We were really lagging the rest of the country, and you can see it here. This is employment growth. So during the recession, South Carolina was hit a lot worse than the U.S. as a whole. And during the recovery, it took South Carolina a little while to get back. here. You can see in 2009, 2010, we continued to lag. It's been very different this time around. During most of the pandemic, South Carolina was well outperforming the U.S., but you can see in the most recent months, it shifted. What it looks like has happened, and this, you would see the same thing if you look at South Carolina and North Carolina. South Carolina was really outperforming North Carolina, and then all of a sudden it flipped, and now North Carolina is significantly outperforming South Carolina. Eventually we'll have the research to know what happened, but what I think happened is that the states that opened up earlier grew faster in the beginning, but then in the long run, it didn't make a difference. So in the long run, South Carolina, ended a lot of the stay-at-home mandates earlier than North Carolina and a lot of other states, and so the growth happened earlier, but then other people are catching up, essentially, is what it looks like. And so this shows you the states in our district. So the 5th district of the Federal Reserve, so the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond's district is the Carolinas, Virginia, Maryland, West Virginia, and Washington, D.C. So I know this is hard to see. There's a lot going on. But what I'll point out to you is North Carolina is the only state in our district that is now above pre-pandemic employment. And you can see so this index is to pre-pandemic. And so in the beginning, everybody had this significant kind of crash, right? But then you'll see that the Carolinas, South Carolina is the second line. South Carolina and North Carolina are the only 2 states in our district that are above U.S. at this point. Virginia was for a while, but then Virginia has not been doing as well recently. And Washington, D.C. continues to lag. They've picked up a bit. They were really bad for a while. Washington, D.C. is an odd place, right? You don't have a lot of people that live in Washington, D.C. A lot of people commute in from outside of the district. And so D.C. has been pretty empty from like an office space point of view because people are, quite frankly, I think they don't want to make the commute unless they have to, right? And so a lot of them have continued to work from home. And then also the leisure and hospitality market was bottomed out in D.C. They rely very heavily on international tourism and also on education-related tourism. I know I had a 5th grader and an 8th grader that were supposed to go to D.C. last year that didn't get to go, right? So those types of trips are a big part of what D.C. does, and so they've really lagged. So this is change in employment by MSA in South Carolina. There are 3 MSAs, Myrtle Beach, Spartanburg, and Charleston, that now have exceeded pre-pandemic employment. And you can see Myrtle Beach has by a lot. The reason for this, there's a couple things going on, but in general, places on the coast have done really well. Hilton Head is more of a mixed bag because if you look at Hilton Head's MSA, it actually goes pretty far inland and it includes some places like in Beaufort County that are really still pretty far from the coast. But MSAs that are on the coast or in the mountains have done pretty well because people could A, kind of naturally socially distance in those places, and B, they have had a lot of immigration. There are a lot of people who have come to live in those places that are working remotely from wherever at this point. And we've also had an acceleration of retirements, which I'll talk about soon, and people have moved there to retire. So the rest of the MSAs in South Carolina are negative, but you can see Greenville is right where the state is. But there are a couple, Florence and Sumter, which are smaller, more rural MSAs that are lagging even the U.S. as a whole. This is one of my favorite ways to look at employment data because it shows both short-term growth and long-term growth. And the bigger the bubble, the bigger the MSA. On the x-axis, you have year-over-year employment change. The y-axis is 10-year change. So even in places like Sumter and Florence that are lagging, they still have both short and long-term employment growth. This is important because if you looked at a lot of states, about half the MSAs actually have lost employment over this same period of time, over a 10-year period of time. So if you were to even look at North Carolina, there are some states that are down here that have short-term growth but long-term losses. If you were to look at a state like California or Illinois, you would see some in a quadrant over here, which is where you don't want to be for sure, where they're having both short-term and long-term losses. That becomes really concerning because you have a shrinking tax base, shrinking employment base, some bad stuff going on then. But in South Carolina, and I included Charlotte on here because I live in Rock Hill, South Carolina, which is part of the Charlotte MSA, right? And so you can see that some of these, Charleston, Charlotte, Myrtle Beach, Hilton Head, have really grown at Spartanburg very quickly over the past 10 years. Similar patterns in unemployment rate. Like I said before, last recession, South Carolina really had a very high unemployment rate. And you can see we were above the national average until 2014, and then kind of consistently above the national average until 2017, and you see this change. Leading up to the pandemic, we were at all-time lows for unemployment rates in South Carolina, and we're not far from that now. We're at 3.5% now, 2.9% was the all-time low. But as I mentioned, I said like earlier in the recovery, South Carolina was more significantly outperforming the nation than they are now. You can kind of see that in the past couple of months, but still doing well. So what's not doing well? Well, this is the U.S. numbers, and this actually on the way here was talking to a reporter about this because I think it is very newsworthy. This is shifting from being a story about leisure and hospitality to being a story about leisure and hospitality and education. And I do a lot of research in education, so I find this extraordinarily interesting. When the pandemic hit right away, a lot of the jobs that were lost were leisure and hospitality jobs, right? These places closed down, people couldn't work. And we saw job losses across other sectors as well. But what's been happening is over time, most sectors are adding jobs, but we're seeing more and more losses in government and education and health services. Let me explain these two sectors because the names are a little misleading. Education and health services is just private education and healthcare. Okay, so private colleges and universities, private K through 12, and like daycare centers. Okay, government includes public education jobs. If you look at the government job losses, the federal government has stayed about flat. The losses are in state and local government. If you look down even further, you'll see they're in state education services and local education services. What's the difference? Local education services is mostly K through 12. There are some exceptions to that. Your Governor's School for Humanities that you have right down the road here, that's a state institution, so those teachers are in state government. But most state education jobs are public colleges and universities. So now what we're seeing is leisure and hospitality is adding back a good number of jobs, but some of these education jobs are proving to be much stickier in terms of their losses. South Carolina, you see the same thing, and the government sector actually lost another 900 jobs in January. That data just came out last week. So what is going on here? It's not that school districts are laying people off. Instead, people are leaving, and they are not able to refill the jobs. In some districts, public schools have lost a lot of enrollment. There are certain places where a large number of kids have switched to homeschooling or no schooling in some cases. What I mean by that is some kids that have fallen just off the radar entirely, which is terrifying. But if you talk to people in school districts, this is happening. And so there are, overall, I think there's been about a 5% decline in public school enrollment. So it may be they don't need to hire back all the teachers that have left or staff members that have left, but there's still a lot of job openings. If you were to go right now and look at Greenville County schools, I guarantee you there's some, I haven't looked, but I feel very confident there's some teacher openings. In this time of year, you really wouldn't see that normally. Same thing on the education side. What's happening in higher ed is both interesting and concerning. Semi-elite to elite private universities are thriving. They have record high enrollments. So if you look at a school like my son goes to Rhodes College in Memphis, they have record freshman class. I think if you looked at Furman, they're doing a lot better now than they were a couple years ago, especially. But tuition-dependent private schools, so smaller private schools, so in the state of South Carolina, schools like a Limestone or Presbyterian is another good example. They have really been struggling. And then same thing with public. So the elite public schools doing great. The flagships are doing okay. They're staying about the same because like a University of South Carolina or Clemson, they can open the floodgates just a little bit and get a few more students in. That's easy for them to do. But the regional publics, so Winthrop, USC Upstate, they're really struggling. So, for example, in our district, I cover higher ed for the whole district. Radford University in Virginia is down 27% in enrollment. Longwood is down about the same. So this is concerning because not every student is well served by a big flagship university. I went to the University of Georgia, taught at the University of Tennessee. University of Tennessee, I had 370 kids in my principles of economics classroom. I went to Winthrop, there were 40 max. Big difference. Some kids are not well served in that three. I taught many a kid that slept through every class I taught because they weren't well served. And they did. They weren't well served in a classroom of 370, right? So this is something that is really interesting. So schools like USC Upstate and Winthrop have had hiring freezes for several years now, at least since the pandemic started. And so what's happening is staff are leaving and they're not refilling those positions. So when you see these job losses, sometimes it can be easy to people think like, oh, a job loss must be people like not hiring, or firing people or laying them off. It's not necessarily that. It could be John moves on to this new firm and there's nobody there to take John's job. So just wanted to point that out. I think there's a similar thing going on with manufacturing. We talked to a lot of manufacturers. Most of them have a tremendous number of job openings. So I don't really think there's a shortage of manufacturing jobs in South Carolina. I think there's a shortage of candidates for employees that are candidates for manufacturing jobs. We definitely have a skills mismatch where a lot of people that lost their jobs in leisure and hospitality, they don't have the skills just to jump in to be a teacher or work in advanced manufacturing. At the same time, we've seen enrollment in community colleges nationwide decline by 14.8% over the past 2 years. So there also hasn't been people rushing back to get retrained for these skills. So this skills mismatch definitely persists. Another thing that's really interesting is what's going on in labor force participation rate. So while we only have, we're down about 1% in terms of employment, labor force participation rate has only recovered about 60% of where we were pre-pandemic. So this is the percentage of people that could be working that are working or looking for work, okay? I show you this history because this is a really important part of the story. And if you're working for an organization that doesn't understand the demographic situation that's going on right now, you should be trying to help them understand that, because a lot of this, I know y'all are CFAs, y'all are numbers people like me. You understand numbers well. Not everybody does, as you well know. But this is a numbers game, okay? So I want to give you like a little quick history lesson on labor force participation rate. So post-World War II, I actually feel like I personally think a lot of the recovery we're in right now is similar to a post-World War II recovery, in that where people are wanting to consume, we're trying to make a bunch of stuff, but we don't have the labor to do everything we're wanting to do. At this period of time, what solved this beginning in the 1960s was twofold. What do you think grew? I mean, this is tremendous. We went from 59% labor force participation rate to 67%. So two factors. What do you think they were?
Women in the workforce.
Women in the workforce. So women flooded during this period of time. And so while overall labor force participation rate went up by about 7 percentage points, female labor force participation rate went up by 17 percentage points. So that was part of it. Anybody know what the other one was?
Immigration. Education.
Baby boomers. This is when baby boomers entered the working age. So we went from having a huge generation of children to having a huge generation of workers during this period of time. But labor force participation rate has been falling since 2000. Okay? So we have had a persistent decline in labor force participation rate since that time. And actually, if you look, it has been mostly a decline in the male labor force participation rate. So what has been going on? Well, there's been a few things going on. And so the question is, will it go back to where it was before? But at our table we were talking about before, does the Fed have like a canned presentation you have to do? And I said, no, actually, nobody even looks at what we go out and say twice. We say it most of the time. They trust us to impart our knowledge to you guys. And so this is my views. You would find economists that disagree with me on this. But I feel pretty strongly that labor force participation is not going to fully recover. And for some demographic groups, it probably will, but for others, it likely will not. And that is driven by several factors, but three of them are here. And most of what I'm going to talk to you about here are things that were going on before the pandemic. So these were trends we were already seeing that have just been accelerated. The first is baby boomer retirements. And there is this MZ report. It's called the Demographic Drought. You can get it online for free. It's a phenomenal document that goes through a lot of this. Some of the stuff I'm going to show you, and then some of this is my own research. But first is baby boomer retirements. The second is changes in attitudes and norms around work. And then the third is the decline in fertility rates, or what's sometimes called the 50-year baby bust, because we are in year 50 of it at this point. It began in the 70s. There's also two additional issues that deserve attention. The first is the opioid epidemic. There's an estimated 10 million people that have used opioids every single day. It significantly affects work, which isn't surprising, right? If you're on opioids, it's very difficult to work. And then also the large number of people with criminal backgrounds. I actually went to an event yesterday in Spartanburg done by Fifth Third Bank, an economist at Fifth Third Bank that's done some work on this. But 34% of all men out of the labor force have criminal records. A lot of these people have been completely shut out from the labor force because of that. This is changing, though. There are a lot more people that are now willing to give people kind of a second chance. Second chance hiring has become a big thing. The bad news is all of this is actually a global issue. The good news is the Carolinas are going to fare better than most of the United States in many of these things. And I also think, and I'll go through some things I think that can be done to make this better, and some of it I think is already making it better. Some of it is why we're seeing labor force participation rate click up right now. So the first is the baby boomer retirements. So if you look at labor force participation rates since February 2020, they've declined by almost 3% for those over age 55, and by almost 8.5% those 65 and older with no disability. There are actually a lot of people that work past age 65, so to have an 8.5% decline is actually a large number of people. That is a big part of who is missing. We've seen very little movement in that group over the past 2 years. As a matter of fact, we saw kind of more and more people leave, and now it's flattened out a bit. They've left for multiple reasons. One is that during most of the pandemic, people's 401k balances looked really good, and so they maybe could retire sooner than they expected. I talked to a bank recently. Their stock price doubled during the pandemic, so it was a great time for people just to walk away that held a lot of the stock. The second thing is that we had a massive shift in technology in the workplace, and there were a lot of people over age 65 that were still working. My dad was one of them. He's a money manager, and they sent him home with this technology they never used, and he was like, no, I'm done. I was going to retire in 2 years. I'm done. I can't print out every document and read. I'm not doing this. So that happened. And then also, anytime you have a crisis, people re-examine what they're doing, right? And so there were also a lot of people, I think, who thought, okay, what am I doing? I can retire. I like my wife more than I thought I did. I'm gonna start staying home, So a lot of people retired, and the baby boomer generation is the wealthiest generation in history, much due to the fact that they are the first generation that had a two-income household in a lot of cases. And so on average, at retirement, baby boomers have $1.2 million in wealth, much higher than any other generation. However, this wealth is also impacting their children, who are the millennials in most cases. It is impacting their attitude around work. And so I'm going to go over this stuff a little bit, and I'm not millennial bashing. I'm almost a millennial. I'm a Gen Xer by 2 years. And my sister's a millennial, and I feel like she fits the stereotype perfectly. So I remind her of that a lot. But I'm not bashing millennials, but there were a lot of concerning signs in terms of work numbers with millennials before the pandemic, and we've seen a lot of it accelerate. The millennial generation now are 25 to 40-year-olds. People get very confused about this. They think like kids in college, they are millennials. They are not. They are the Z generation, or the Zoomers, as some of them call themselves. Millennials are 25 to 40, okay? They are the largest group in the workforce now, and I can see several millennials in this room. So they make up a large part, and you likely don't fit these stereotypes because you're in this room. But before the pandemic, we had already seen a major change in male labor force participation. So prime age male labor force participation is 25 to 54-year-olds. So it's like after you should be in college, but before you should retire, that age group. In 1980, so during the baby boomers generation, 94% of men in that age range worked. In 2019, that was 89%. So it's a 5 percentage point decline, but that's 3 million missing workers. This is a lot of people. So what are they doing? This is some of the most depressing research you can read. I have 3 teenage boys, and so I do a lot of research in this field because I'm trying to figure out how to get them out of my house. I love them, but they gotta go. And so I'm trying to figure out how to do that. So there's a few things that we've seen. So during a recession, it is very common for people to shift from full-time work to part-time work because they can't find a good full-time job. The weird thing about the Great Recession was that we never went back to the normal full-time work pattern before that, and millennial men have shown a much larger preference for part-time work, okay? This could be gig economy work. It could also just be part-time jobs. This research is a very, very well done paper by Aguiar and her co-authors showed that men between the ages of 21 to 30, and this was back when millennials were in that age group, their work hours declined by 12% overall during that period of time. In addition, 15% of men in that age group did not work a single week in 2014. They also used time use survey data, which we have very good time use survey data in the US, and they show that 75% of those increased leisure hours were spent playing video games or on a computer. I always tell people, this sounds crazy to me until I look around my house and I'm like, what are my 3 boys doing? And they're like, they're on something, yeah. They're on something. So it's really interesting. These are some interesting statistics. So sometimes I'll have people say, well, there are more stay-at-home dads now. That is not, yes, there are, and that is not what is going on in terms of a broader trend. Men out of the labor force spend only 30 extra minutes a day than men who work full-time on household chores, and they spend less time taking care of their children than men that work full-time. Less time, yes. So this was already a trend before, and this is data that's active now. So this is combination of the Z generation and the millennials. For the first time ever last year, the majority of 18 to 29-year-olds lived with their parents full-time. So this does not count college students, okay? This is full-time, 52-week a year, living with their parents. So 52% of all 18 to 29-year-olds live with their parents. What is going on here? It's a cultural shift, and a lot of this has been driven by baby boomer wealth. People don't like to talk about it because they don't want to admit that maybe they've helped their kids be a little lazier than maybe they were at that age, but there's a lot of that going on where parents have allowed kids to live there. They've allowed people not to have full-time jobs and things like that. So this was happening pre-pandemic, along with opioid use, along with worse mental health. So if you think about what's happened during the pandemic, if you played too many video games in 2019, you definitely play too many in 2022, right? If you had mental health issues in 2019, they're worse now. If you used opioids, it's worse now. We just hit an all-time record in opioid deaths last year. So in my opinion, some of the labor force participation data we're seeing is actually it's just an acceleration of what we saw going on before. I've been tracking labor force participation by age and by race and by gender. And what you'll see is Black male labor force participation rate has actually way more than recovered from pre-pandemic norms. Hispanic males are down a little bit. White males are down more significantly. And then females are down more overall than men. And the research on that shows that that is mostly tied to childcare, we think. Those childcare issues, in theory at least, get remedied at some point. There are a lot of childcare centers that shut down during the pandemic. I mean, think about, a place like Greenville, your downtown has still been very active during the pandemic. I work in Uptown Charlotte. It's a ghost town compared to normal. And I had the economist yesterday who presented on the Second Chance Hiring told me he thought Charlotte was busier than New York. So, the bigger the city, the more shut down they've been during the period of time because of things like public transportation and high-rise buildings and things like that. So daycare centers in those places, a lot of them have shut down. There's also a lot of daycare centers we talk to that would like to operate at 100%, but they can't find the staff to operate at 100%. So there are persistent issues with schooling. Those should get better. So I do expect those women in most part to rejoin, but some of these other things that are happening things like opioid use, computer use, mental health. I don't necessarily expect that to just magically get better. I'll talk about what I think could help in a minute. The last thing is the baby bust. So this is the thing I always like to do in these presentations. So raise your hand if one of your grandparents had 5 or more siblings. One of your grandparents. Yeah, okay. Raise your hand if one of your parents has 5 or more siblings. Okay, less people, but if you raise your hand if you have 5 or more kids. No one. This is how it always works out. Sometimes there'll be one person who's like, I do. Yeah, embarrassingly. People have had less babies, and it's going lower and lower every year. But this actually started with the baby boomers in the 70s. So we have to have, every woman needs to have 2.1 babies for replacement, to replace the female and the male. And it's 2.1 because unfortunately there are infant and deaths and people that don't make it to adulthood. We've been below 2.1 since 1970, so that's why it's a 50-year baby bust. But we've been way below that since the Great Recession. And last year, the population grew at the lowest rate since the year 1900. And it's estimated, this is crazy, but there were 500,000 fewer babies born that's a typo, that should be in 2021, than would have been expected if the pandemic had never happened. So why are people having fewer children? There's all sorts of things, everything from the cost of childcare to urbanization, people live in smaller spaces. Delay and decline of marriage is a huge thing. And actually, if you look at a lot of this actually goes back to the young men not working too. The average age of marriage and first child now for men is over age 30. So if you think about the psyche of that, when you're, like I've got an 18-year-old son right now. He's a freshman in college. When I was in college, I was thinking, in 4 years, I'll probably buy a house, which I did, by the way. I got married 4 years after that. But my son is thinking in 4 years, he's going to be like hanging out on the beach or something. He has no plans of that, right? That's not even, so if you think you have 12 more years to get to where you need to be responsible to care for another human, you feel like you have longer time. There's not necessarily the sense of urgency to go start a career. However, we know from research that if you don't get started young, if you're working for DoorDash at 25, there's very little potential that you're going to have your CFA at 35, right? So it's an interesting kind of psychological thing that's going on. This is a global thing. Believe it or not, Mexico is below replacement rate. So while immigration can help with some of this, and I have it as a solution on here, it can't solve like the world's problem with it. It still can partially solve our problem because so many people would like to move to the United States. Yesterday, actually, the economist I was mentioning said he had heard some people saying like, because of our labor force issues right now, a smart policy might be to open up and accept as many Ukrainian refugees as wanted to come. It's not like the worst thing I've heard recently, because we do need to do something with immigration. We hear a lot about this from both the lower end of the labor market and the upper end. So lower end, so staff at hotels, restaurants, back door, back into the back of the house at restaurants. Farmers not having enough. There was a banana pepper shortage this year because some of the migrant workers that usually pick banana peppers in South Carolina didn't come from Guatemala. So we hear about it there. We also hear about it a lot in like life sciences. We're talking to people in Raleigh where they can't get, the H-1B process has become much more complicated, so it's difficult to get engineers and scientists. So that could really help on both ends of the spectrum. Flexibility is a huge thing. I'm sure some of y'all are dealing with this at your place of employment. Workers are demanding more flexibility. They're not asking for it, they are demanding it. And LinkedIn shows that workers are 2.5 times more likely to apply for a job if it's remote or has a large remote portion of it. And so not only remote versus in person, but also flexibility in terms of how many hours a week, what hours those are during the day. We're hearing that some female workers, for example, are asking to work morning hours and then night hours so they have afternoon hours to do things with their children, pick up from school, those sorts of things. That can really help people that need that. Fertility incentives are an option where you pay people to have babies. This is not my favorite option, but a lot of countries have tried it. But there could be incentives and I think there is the potential to get more subsidized childcare, for example. Childcare is really, I know some of you in here probably have young children. It is astronomically expensive. And so it's not surprising that people aren't having as many kids, right? If you're having to pay, my sister-in-law just had twins, and they're paying $3,500 a month for infant care. And they have 2 other children in daycare. There's no way it financially makes sense for her to work right now. She's an attorney, but she works for a judge. There's no way it makes sense, but she wants a career, right? So she kind of has to keep working. So if there were subsidies for that, that might help too. And then changes in recruiting philosophies. And I actually think this is why we're seeing labor force participation kind of jump the past couple of months. We are hearing from more and more companies that they've stopped testing for marijuana in drug tests. They've stopped doing criminal background checks, which, by the way, is not the right way to do that. Second chance hiring actually is about looking at a criminal background and saying we're willing to accept this and here's how we're going to work with you on it, not just we're going to pretend people don't have criminal records. Plus, you might end up hiring somebody dangerous. But we are hearing from firms that they've stopped doing that. We're hearing that they are allowing people to work. They'll say, we wanted to hire somebody in Columbia, but we just hired this amazing person in Columbus, Ohio, and they're going to work remote. So, and then the big one is analyzing whether or not degrees are really necessary. This is another one that we're hearing a lot about. If somebody can code, do they really need a computer science degree? Maybe not. Maybe those hours spent on the computer can pay off in other ways, right? So we are hearing about that a lot. And I think if you look, I mentioned Black male labor force participation rate has really increased pretty substantially in the past few months. I think part of that is that some people that have had a harder time getting into the labor force because of criminal backgrounds. One in 3 Black men has a criminal record. So whether it's that or whether it is a degree, have had some boundaries or speed bumps have been able to enter the labor force. So job openings are at all-time highs. That's not surprising given what I just told you. There's 11 million job openings, 6 million people looking for jobs. So that's a big issue. That 5 million is a big issue. And so what we're seeing is wages are going up. They're not going up as much as you might think or as much as I feel like everybody I talk to says they're raising wages by like 10% or 20%. That's not what the data is showing us. But here is the interesting thing. Solid line is low skills, red line is medium skills, mid skills. The dotted blue line is high skills. And you'll see that normally lower skilled workers get lower wage increases. So like when I would teach in college, I would say not only with the college degree do you start out making more, you also get bigger increases every year. What we've seen is these have collapsed. So it's really lower skill wage earners that are benefiting the most because they're the ones that work in these hard to fill jobs right now, right? And so it's a bit messy, but I'll tell you what this is. So we pulled out leisure and hospitality, which is in the lighter blue, and we looked at nominal wage increases and real wage increases. Real wage increases take inflation into consideration. And so what you'll see is nominal wage increases for leisure and hospitality are over 10%. So if you look at real wages, they're up about 3% because we had 7.5% inflation, right? But for everybody else, nominal wage increases have been about 5%. So real wages are down about 2%. So real wages are what you can actually buy with your wage, right? So for most of us, we got a decent raise last year, but it wasn't 7.5%. So overall, we're making less money. Producer prices are way up. So are consumer prices. So this is CPI data. There's no doubt that inflation is well above the 2% target. And like I said, this is mostly driven by labor shortages and supply chain issues. Here is what is really interesting though. So you probably heard the Fed use the word transitory last year. Everybody picked up on it. I can promise you that the Federal Reserve will probably never put the word transitory in any document ever again because people took it and ran with it. But I'm going to show you why they were saying it. What we did was we look at what's contributing to the change in inflation. And we pulled out some things that are COVID specific. Hotels and motels, airfare, new vehicles, recreation, used vehicles. And green is everything else. So I want you to look back last spring and summer. Green was actually negative. Everything else we were seeing deflation. But this gray bar is just used vehicle prices. So if you look at what was driving inflation back last spring and summer, it was used cars. You don't use monetary policy to settle the used car market. That's not appropriate, right? But what we saw change was in the fall, and it was in November that Jay Powell said, we're not going to use the word, we're retiring the word transitory, I believe, were his exact words. The green bar started getting bigger, and some of these other prices started settling out a bit. Used car prices are still making up a pretty big percentage of the overall change, but it's smaller than what it was certainly back here. So this is why, like, this is transitory. This is not. This is change. And transitory just means temporary at some level, right? Eventually, the used car market will settle out. Right now, there are nonsensical things. I just bought a new car, had to wait forever to get it. But when I went to test drive cars, there were no cars to test drive except for used cars. And the used cars, like one of the cars I test drove, the used car that was 2 years old was $5,000 more than the sticker price of the new car. And I said, but why would anybody buy that? And he said, because they don't want to wait 8 months for a car. So they'll pay $5,000, which is crazy. I also went on car lots where there were new cars, but you couldn't test drive them because they didn't have chips in them, so they weren't safe because they didn't have backup cameras and any of the other safety features. But you could buy it and drive it off the lot. Once you owned it, you could drive it because then they weren't liable for it. And the promise was one day when we get a chip, you can bring it back. So it had like a black, and these are decent cars, nice cars, black plastic box where the screen would be with a promise of one day we'll get you a computer to go in there. No thanks. I'm like, of course, as an economist, I'm like, great, now I need to have a conversation about this situation. Are people doing that? And the answer was yes. Yes, we will sell this car probably today. Not an economist. No economist is buying that. So anyway, so that's kind of what's happened is we are seeing more broad-based inflation at this time. So this is from the FOMC statement. You can read this yourself. But essentially what they said was the stuff in Russia and the Ukraine is causing issues with inflation, mostly because of gas prices, but some other things as well. Wheat is another thing that Ukraine and Russia provide a large percentage of the world's wheat. And so it'll in fact impact that as well. If you're a big bread eater, you'll be paying more. But if anything, there's an upside inflation risk there. It could get worse, right? It's probably not going to remedy itself and get better overnight. And so what they did was they said they raised the rate to 25 basis points, and they anticipate that ongoing increases in the target range will be appropriate. In other words, more rate increases are coming. So I'll show you this kind of to close, and I'll take some questions. You know, I told you they do projections every other FOMC meeting. They also ask the FOMC members to predict where rates are going to be. Well, this is pretty good information because these are the people that vote. Only thing is, all 19 of them get to put a dot on there, and we don't know whose dot is who. So, like, this could be a voting member or not. This could be a voting member or not. So we don't know that. But what we do know is that they're changing over time. So if you went back to the October meeting last year, only a couple of Fed FOMC participants thought we'd have a rate increase in 2022. Then in December, everybody thought we would have at least one, and almost everybody thought we would have 2 or 3. Now it's gotten much more dispersed, which means there's going to be some interesting conversations at that table, which I think is a very good thing. But also they're predicting more like 5 or 6 over this next year. I will point out to you that this is still historically low rates. Like if you look at pre-Great Recession, we were at 5.25%, which was a pretty low federal funds rate at that point. And only one person thinks we're going above 3%. I wouldn't be surprised. You've probably heard Jim Bullard from St. Louis has been very outspoken, and he voted against the FOMC action because he wanted to do a 50 basis point increase. That's probably his dot. If I was a bet maker, that's who I would bet is there. But what I will point out to you is that the longer run strategy, what they're saying is kind of, this is just like we think over time the rate should be, around 2.5%. So they're not expecting it to go even back. I mean, this chart only goes up to 5, so kind of historically normal federal funds rates would be beyond what this chart can even show. So I think it is important to point that out too, that rates are clearly going up, but they're still relatively low compared to what we would think of as the norm. So where do we go from here? For me, the geopolitical issues are very concerning because, as we're seeing with gas prices, and I'll tell you honestly, as an economist, part of me is glad, I don't want to pay the higher gas prices, but I'm somewhat glad they've gone up because it does show that there are impacts from geopolitical issues, where we don't live in a bubble. The fact that oil is a global market and Russia is one of the big, I think they are the biggest producer now. Or actually, I think U.S. is number one, Russia's number two. It's a global market, right? So when the number two producer goes to war, there is a response that causes prices to go up. But that's very concerning to me. Also, even though we seem to be moving more towards endemic, if there was a COVID variant that was very deadly, that would obviously cause issues. Also, another huge risk out there is inflation not responding to what the Fed is doing as much as we would like. People ask me all the time, how worried are you about this? I will tell you, I taught a class called Money and Banking for 17 years before I worked at the Fed. So I taught about the Fed for 17 years and I worked there. I'll be honest in saying that when I left to go to the Fed, I thought, I wonder what I'm going to think about it once I'm inside. Because I've taught, they're independent, they're apolitical, yada, yada, yada. I have been so much more impressed with the process than I thought I would be, even as a professor. I trust the people at the table. I trust the process. You wouldn't believe how intense the process is for us preparing our president, Tom Barkin, every single cycle for FOMC, and he's not even a voting member right now. Just for him to be able to put his dot on that, we're preparing him at the same level we would if he was a voting member, and the process is just extraordinarily well done, in my opinion. So I trust all of that. I trust that we have tools to deal with it. I also believe we're in a very weird time right now. And so would I be super surprised if the economy didn't respond in the way it has in the past? No, because there's a lot of things going on that I can't necessarily explain using traditional supply and demand models. One of the reasons I say that is if you look at debt to income ratios right now, they're actually really low. And so the reason a lot of times people respond pretty rapidly to Federal Reserve policy changes is rates go up, right? The cost of debt goes up, and so people pull back. But if you don't have much debt, do you pull back as much? We don't know. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But I trust that the Fed, I do trust that they are poised to address inflation. They have other policy tools. They can use them if they need to. It'll just be interesting to see how long it takes and how quickly the market responds. So I know I threw a lot out at you, so I'll stop there and take questions if you have them. Mm-hmm.
I know that Canada and Mexico have much lower inflation rates than we do. What do you think explains that?
Yeah, so, we have very, I actually heard somebody say this, an economist say this recently, and I think it's true. We also consume a lot different than anybody else in the world. And part of the issue is right now people have a strong taste for consumption. People want to go out and spend money. And we pumped a lot of money into the market, right? So people have money. If you look at how much money, especially higher income people, have a ton of money they're sitting on right now. They changed their spending patterns. They made a lot of investment income. They're sitting on a lot of money to spend. And so the appetite, that is kind of a supply and demand thing. The demand for consumption is very high and the supply of labor is not able to adjust as quickly. So I actually think much of it is driven by the labor shortage side of it versus supply chain issues, because supply chain issues are kind of universally a problem right now. We also, though, do have some industries concentrated in the United States, like auto manufacturing, that have been especially hard hit by some of these by some of the supply chain issues and chip shortages. So if you look at Germany, also has a lot of, they've been hit really hard too. Mm-hmm.
Could you talk about the implications of the Fed starting this tightening cycle with a historically flat yield curve? For example, this morning, 3, 5, 7s were all inverted to 10s. Mm-hmm. And so how do you raise 5 or 6 times when you clearly invert the curve, and we know, I think everybody knows the implications?
Yeah. I think, there's also been discussion about the Fed reducing its balance sheet I mean, the Fed's a big holder of all those bonds, and so I think there are ways in which they can do those things simultaneously that might help that, because the Fed holds all different term bonds. So they could, I don't pretend to understand the exact modeling of how that is done, but I do know that they have research on how they can raise rates without inverting hopefully without inverting the yield curve by doing kind of those things simultaneously. And they have talked about, if you look they don't release it in their statement, but if you look in the minutes that they don't release the transcripts for 5 years, but they do release abbreviated minutes, and in the minutes you'll see discussions about reducing the balance sheet that are going on.
Can you speak to the changes in the demographic makeup of immigration, right? Because 25 years ago, it was a 27-year-old single male, right? That's not what we're seeing. So when it hits or when it helps, that's a different impact.
Yeah, one of the things that we're seeing right now is a lot of the immigration is older people, and it's through chain migration, because that's so chain migration is like once you've been here a certain number of years, you can bring your parents, for example. That's one of the immigration paths that hasn't been slowed down too much. That's not what's going to help our labor force issues, right? A person who immigrated that made a bunch of money that can now bring their parents from China, that's not going to help us. What's going to help is if we bring more younger workers. While I was at Winthrop, he mentioned I was the associate dean. Right before I left, we had our first ever H-1B visa applications by professors revoked. Like, no, they can't stay. That's outrageous to me. If somebody's gotten a PhD in finance from a U.S. institution, by the way, with the institution, like the state funding their assistantship the whole time they're in school, most likely in their tuition, let them stay and be a finance professor. There's certain groups that, and also we do also need workers in agricultural jobs and jobs like the reason there was a banana pepper shortage is banana pepper plants are low to the ground, and it's terribly arduous work. It's really awful, and they can't find local people to take those jobs. So that's why you'll see a lot of agriculture. They're really pushing for also more like migrant worker and programs and increases in lower wage workers as well. Yeah.
On balance sheet reduction, any sense on timing and pace and ultimately the level they want to get to? Is it like $5 trillion?
I think a few things. I think, and this is me speculating a lot of it, so this is definitely not an opinion, a view from the Federal Reserve in general. I think they want to get out of the mortgage-backed security market a bit. We weren't in that market pre-Great Recession, and I think there's probably some desire to cool off that market a little bit. And then also, I think the timing somewhat depends on what the yield curve does.
And then, quick follow-up: is there still a Fed put, or is the Fed still, I guess, are they less sensitive to market volatility? So is it down 20, maybe it's down 30 now? Where if you go back to like December of 18, it got to down about 20 before the Fed said, "All right, we're going to policy."
Yeah, I think I think that they're being more transparent than they normally are in their meetings. They don't normally say like, and we're going to increase rates later this year. So I think, and once again, this is just speculation, but I also know like the Federal Reserve Board of Governors has over 300 economists with PhDs that work there. And these are the best of the best. And so I also feel really confident that they have models that account for each little, they're monitoring what's happening to everything from gas prices, obviously, to the yield curve, to general inflation, to see what the timing of this should be. Does that mean it works flawlessly? No, right? There's no exact science to this. And quite frankly, markets change. And one of the things that's really changed is, and some people don't even know this because you took economics before this happened. When I took economics as an undergrad, most of the time we taught about how one of the things the Fed can do is change the reserve requirement. There's no such thing as a reserve requirement anymore. And that's because now we're in what we call an excess reserves regime. And that's because we pay banks for reserves that they hold at the Fed. So the reason we switched to this is when the Great Recession, one of the big issues were that banks weren't well capitalized. So when things went south, it went south fast because banks were over leveraged. And they had the bare minimum of reserves. Well, now we pay banks for the reserves they hold at the Fed. So they hold a lot of reserves at the Fed. So the financial markets are also in a much different place than they were pre-Great Recession. And so that changes a lot of markets as well because the financial system is making different decisions.
How much time does the Fed spend on the currency problem, right? Because like what happened in oil is it's location trades, right? Russian oil's at $80. Our oil went to 130. Eventually the Chinese, I mean, they're in Saudi Arabia now, but 4 out of every dollar are overseas because they have claims back, right? If that changes and those dollars come back, we're looking at 5% inflation for the next 30 years.
Yeah.
Unless they're soaked up.
I'm not too worried about that. I think that, oil is a bizarre market and you've got lots of different things going on, right? You've got the fact that it is a global market. We don't rely a lot on it. We barely use any Russian oil. But it doesn't matter because countries like Germany use a lot. And so because they can't get the Russian oil, they're going to places like Saudi Arabia and Canada and getting it from the same people we get it from. And so the global price is going up, right? Which you would think would then make the U.S. produce more. But we're not because there are all sorts of oil permits that are going unused. And part of that is a labor and supply chain issue too. They can't get the people and the machinery they need to pull more out of the ground. And so there's a lot of stuff going on at once that's causing oil and gas prices to go up. And I mean, I do think what this does is accelerate the conversation around renewable energy because, if I drove an electric car right now, some people in this room probably do, my life would be a lot better because I wouldn't have to be buying this very expensive gas. So I think it does probably accelerate some of that conversation because what we see is if we are relying on this global market, which by the way is controlled by countries that we don't necessarily have a lot of trust in, right? We're trusting the Russians and the Saudis and the Iranians, to do this, then we are at risk for there being big issues. So I think you'll see more and more push for renewables.
You mentioned the child, taking care of children.
Yeah.
And the child tax credit expired. Gas prices are going up. Do you see any concern on the load?
Yes. So I think, some of the data we don't have yet at like the more granular level. Generally we get data like an aggregate level and then we'll be able to see the granular data. But sometimes there's 2-year lags for that. In addition, some of the data that we normally get, they didn't collect or they didn't publish because the collection was so bad during the pandemic. Like they couldn't find people to respond to these surveys they normally do. The American Community Survey from the census is the best example of that, which sucks because we use it a lot. I mean, it's terrible. When that came out, I literally almost started crying and I'm like, I'm about to cry over data. This is the saddest. Like, I'm truly a nerd. But earlier in the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about the concept of a K-shaped recession where some people were coming out better than ever and some people were not. I personally believe that is where we are. I think what I was talking about college enrollment being so high and why is community college enrollment in places at Winthrop and upstate that have a lot of Pell Grant recipients so crappy, but enrollment at expensive private schools higher than ever? I think it's the K-shaped recession story. And I think there's a lot of families where gas prices going up is going to really hurt them because one of the things we saw, and I'm not advocating for any sort of like universal income or anything like that. As an economist, I don't agree with that. But one of the interesting things about COVID is it provided a lot of natural experiments. What happens if all of a sudden we send people all this money at once? Well, if you look at what happened to poverty rates, they plummeted because people that didn't have any, people that were in poverty got a lot of money from the government. And so did a lot of middle income people got a lot of money from the government last year and the year before. And so now that's gone. And so we're going to return to normal for those families. Plus gas and food are more expensive. So yes, I am very worried about that. Mm-hmm.
Do you think the spirit of increased transparency over the past 10 to 15 years is making their job more difficult now?
Yeah, I do. So here is the other thing that I have loved about working at the Fed, because as an economist, I used to write, if you talk to somebody that had me as a professor, the one thing they'll tell you is I always wrote on the first day, politics does not equal economics. I can solve Social Security for you in 2 minutes, and the answer is going to be much higher retirement age. The age for retirement is going to be much higher. But that's politically, forget about it. No matter what party you're in, nobody's going to vote for them. Or if they do, they'll be out of office immediately. The Fed, at least the Richmond Fed, is truly apolitical. We do not have a single conversation about the politics of what we do. I've written articles I write about how the Pell Grant should be expanded significantly. I also wrote about how the unemployment benefits were too generous. And those are on opposite sides of the political spectrum. So that, to me, has been amazing because it shouldn't be about politics. Like, there are economic answers, and it might not be politically palatable, but we ought to be able to at least put out the economic answers. I think that increased transparency makes the apolitical part harder because when the politicians know what you're thinking of doing, they can attack you more for it. So I think it becomes even more important to have people in the roles of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and the Fed presidents that are tough enough for that. Because you have to be, as you can imagine, when you're a Fed president and you have senators and congressmen that want to get at you to talk to you about something, you got to be pretty thick-skinned to be able to hold up. Tom Barkin definitely is thick enough skin, but I do think that becomes even more important. There were a couple of people that were rejected by the Senate for being on the Board of Governors because they were too political in the past few years, and I think that's a good sign that even the politicians view the independence of the Fed as important. So I do think it makes it harder, but right now I feel like we're in a good spot with that.
In the interest of time, we probably need to wrap up, but maybe Laura can hang out.
Yeah,
just
for sure.
Like sidebar conversations. If you
For
have
sure.
more questions, but can we give her another round of applause?
Thank you. I appreciate it.